You are about to watch an interview I recorded with an American foreign volunteer by the name of James, also known as Spaghetti Cossack, who volunteered to fight in the Ukrainian military with the International Legion and other military units all across Ukraine. This included dangerous recon missions on the front line, like in this footage taken from his current unit. This is the second of two videos covering the interview. The first video, which is already posted on my channel and I suggest you watch that first, covers his time fighting in Ukraine. This video dives into his political beliefs surrounding the war and why he thinks Russia must be disassembled. The purpose of this interview is to give you an unfiltered look into his unique perspective as a foreign volunteer. This video does not serve as an endorsement or condemnation, but as a window into his service and the mind behind the rifle. His beliefs, motivations, experiences, and first-hand testimony of the war serves as one puzzle piece for the generations that come after us and understanding what drove the men and women who fought in or just tried to survive the largest war in Europe since World War II. This is Ukraine Uncensored. Why do you think, as somebody who's been on the ground fighting against the Russians now, do you think they overestimated themselves, underestimated the Ukrainians, too corrupt? Why do you think it didn't turn into the 3-day, few-week scenario that many Russian analysts thought it would be?
That is, so that's a long story. You know, before I left, I rushed out a video for my YouTube channel. And I just had to do that because I had to explain why you're not going to see more videos on that channel for a while. And
I remember seeing the video. You published it because you were heading over.
Yeah, it's probably the fastest video that I ever got done because I taught myself to edit. And I'm still learning a lot, so my work is very rudimentary. It usually takes me forever to do something. In this case, I had about 3 days, so I had to get it done in 2. And as I explained in there, because by this time it was clear, I can't remember if they had already pulled away from Kyiv at that time or they were still stuck there. But the thing is that it became very clear that something was seriously wrong with the Russian army, that everything we had seen, like in Syria, these big exercises like Zapad 2021, this was all basically Potemkin village. And as I explained, like once I could see what was happening, like because as I said, at first I believed the analysts because I actually kind of worked in this field. I did some military analysis on a freelance basis, and you know there are respected sources. But once it started to go wrong, and some of those experts started backpedaling and saying, "Oh no, you gotta understand that they're not fighting according to doctrine. If they were, and just all this nonsense, right?" And suddenly, I went back. I trusted my instincts, and I realized what the problem was. Basically, it's just typical Russian corruption and what they call raspizdystvo, which is really hard to translate. It's just kind of like dumb fuckery, basically. It's like because one of the biggest problems with the Russian military was corruption, right? Like the Russian military is a lot like prison. I have a late relative who actually served as conscript time in it back in the 2000s, and everything he described to me is basically it's like in prison. There's schemes, there's people getting people caught up in schemes so they can get money and exploit them and stuff like that. And really, the Russian military, they embarked on all these massive modernization programs or reform programs, but it was all basically fake. It was painted on, new uniforms, some new gear, elite units that are nicely dressed and everything, but it's all just for show. It's all for the parade. And what really happens is fuel gets sold for money for commanders. Training. Oh, this is the funniest thing. So when it comes to like training, what is happening is commanders would stage training, by which I mean they would go to the shooting range. You'd have guys lay down the prone position with their guns, and they would say, we did marksmanship training today, right? And the reason they take pictures, this is so funny, they introduced this to fight corruption in the army. There's this accountability system where you had to provide pictures of the training that you were giving the troops, right, to show that you did it, right? So what do the Russian officers do? They just go and stage a picture, take the picture, send it, and they said, we did the training, give us the money for it, or give us the ammo, which they might sell, you know what I mean? So basically, it was just this big paper tiger. And the other thing is that
would you say that, like, culturally, a lot of people just viewed it as, like, one of the perks of the job? You hear that a lot about corruption.
Yes, that's common in like the police structures in Russia as well. I think the issue is that Russia has a sort of, and actually going back to Soviet Union, is sort of prison culture, right? And there was a point where, like, for the longest time in Russia, the type of person who joins the military is, they're often not respected. They are seen as somebody who can't do anything else, so they join the army. A lot of times, unfortunately, because Russia depresses many of the national minority territories, a lot of people from Buryatia, for example, or Tuva, they are compelled to join the military because it's their only shot. A contract is their only shot at a decent salary, and so generally Russians will go to great lengths to avoid military service, even in peacetime. It's just not seen as something very respectable, and that prison culture really pervades it a lot, which leads to a breakdown of trust. There's also this sort of authoritarian mentality where it's just like, do it because I'm the commander, end of story, right? Now, that is kind of true in a lot of militaries, but in Russia, it's a little bit more pronounced, right? Because like in the U.S. military, for example, you have the NCOs and the officers, right? NCOs handle a lot of the day-to-day business. NCOs are doing a lot more work, right? So, officers, if they're smart, they will take the input from an NCO who has the experience and knows the lower enlisted guys better, instead of just saying like, well, I'm the lieutenant, do what I say. Or, as is often the case in the U.S. military, the officer delegates the authority to the NCOs and say, you figure it out, right? And that's not the way it works in Russia. In Russia, it's extremely officer heavy. They don't really have an NCO corps. And so what you have is just, some overweight colonel who is skimming money out of everything, and he's using some of his conscripts to build him a summer home somewhere, and that is basically their army. And one thing is, the one reason for the cultural difference is that, as I mentioned before, Ukraine didn't really have a military before about 2015, and so they relied on a lot of volunteers, and they relied on people joining up and signing contracts. And what happened was, because that was necessary, the Ukrainian military had a big influx of basically normal people. You know what I mean? People who were programmers, or maybe they were, mechanics.
This is opposed to who usually signs up.
Yeah, like I said, like in Russia, it's basically the guys who have nothing else they can do. It's guys who come from towns where basically either you drink yourself to death, or you go to the army. There's nothing else.
Is there much like I remember definitely as an American hear this a lot, the idea that in Russia a lot of people compelled by patriotism join the armed forces. Is that true?
No, I mean, most Russians understand that the patriotism is bullshit. They don't really have an alternative, so they don't really stand for anything against it. But you could see when they announced the mobilization in Russia, and they wanted initially about 200,000, I believe, and something like 700,000 to 1 million left. Okay, so that tells you like how much people really believe in this nonsense. Like, most of the people who are sent here are people who just feel they had no choice. They don't know what to do. Unfortunately, a lot of people in Russia have a sort of...
Does that make you pity them at all?
Not really. Like, on a certain level, like, I have the most pity. The thing I'm most concerned about, because I'm a big advocate of decolonization of Russia, and I'm a big advocate for the national minorities, mostly.
When you say decolonization of Russia, what does that mean?
Okay, so a lot of people just thought that, the just thing was that the Union republics of the Soviet Union break off, and then you have this big Russian state there, and nobody really interrogates that further. What we know as the Russian Federation, which is very inappropriately named as it's not a federation. What we know is that was initially known as the RSFSR during the Soviet period. So the Soviet Union was basically a union of all these other Union republics plus the RSFSR, which was the Russian Socialist Federated Soviet Republic. And inside of that was a series of what were called ASSRs, which are autonomous Soviet Socialist republics. So the Union republics would be called SSR. So, for example, here used to be called the Ukrainian SSR or Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. But within certain Soviet republics, you would have these ASSRs. And they were given some autonomy theoretically. It often, at least in the 20s and part of the 30s, it usually had to do with like language training and stuff like that. Indigenous language, media, press, education. However, the issue is in the late Soviet period. Basically, what was happening is the heads of local parties in certain republics basically started to people started to talk about invoking the right to secession, because Union republics, according to the Soviet Constitution, had the right to secede. ASSRs did not have the right to secede, right? And so what's funny is that when the world basically recognized the breakup of the Soviet Union and we said, okay, Kazakhstan has the right to secede, but Bashkortostan or Tatarstan, they're inside Russia, they don't have a right to secede. So according to whom? What? Soviet law that's invalid, right? And the fact is that when we talk about these nations, and most Westerners and outsiders don't even know they exist, if we speak about Tatarstan or Udmurtia, Mari El, Bashkortostan, Chuvashia, most of these are little territories within what some call the Middle Volga region, or to use the Tatar term, Idel-Ural, because the Idel is the Tatar word or Turkic word for Volga.
You keep taking me to Tatar restaurants. You really like their food.
Those are Crimean Tatars, yeah.
Crimean Tatar. Do you have much attachment to this community?
Not so much to the Crimean Tatar community, but like to the Volga Tatars. That's the ones in Tatarstan. They have a lot of the neighbors that are sort of related. So the Bashkorts are related to the Volga Tatars, or sometimes called Kazan Tatars. Chuvash are also a Turkic group. So it's a long story. I won't digress too much into that. But what is important there is that Tatarstan actually had a referendum on sovereignty in 1992. It passed with something like 60% in favor, large turnout, international observation, no violence or anything like that. In fact, the Tatars were very careful to keep it low key, and they started a kind of National Guard unit, but they were unarmed, and so they really wanted to create this impression that, don't worry, this is not going to be like Bosnia or something, right? And the result was that the Russian Supreme Court said that referendum violates the Constitution. Now, compare that to what happened in Crimea, where Russia carries out, in 2 weeks, they carry out a so-called referendum with no actual international or independent observation, with their military occupying the territory. And what it tells you, and what it should tell the people of Tatarstan and other people in Russia who want independence, is next time, bring guns. Right? So, but here's the thing, is that a lot of people don't know this, but when the Russian Empire broke up in 1917, a lot of these peoples already had their own national democratic movements. They wanted to create democratic states. Some of them were sort of socialist leaning, but not Bolshevik per se. And all of these states were crushed by the Bolsheviks eventually. And so the drive for self-determination is there. And the idea that Russia could be broken into parts that would be, have better representation and be free, is definitely something that has been tried before, and I really think in a certain sense it is inevitable, but we need to be careful about we need to be prepared for it so that there's less chaos. When I say chaos, I mean people who work for the State Department will shit their pants when I talk about the breakup of Russia, but it's like it's happening one way or another.
So you believe that the breakup of Russia is inevitable?
Yes, I would say it more like a collapse of Russia.
A collapse.
But the thing that could save more people is if in the wake of this collapse, you have new states arrive and you have a more equitable sharing of power, whereas what you have now and what we've had like for centuries is basically colonial rule from Moscow. And as a result, in many of getting back at Tatars, like Tatars are the largest non-Slavic minority in Russia, and their language is practically dying. It's not banned. It's not like there's an explicit ban that says you can't use the Tatar language somewhere. However, the Russian government is very clever in the way that they make legislation which makes these languages kind of useless and basically discourages even the indigenous people from learning and using their own language. Like a lot of outsiders, they don't get like, why does Ukraine have to mandate language laws and things like that? And the reason why is because you have to undo what was basically a colonial policy, right? Like pretty much every Ukrainian can speak Russian, and you hear Russian all the time here. I mean, most of the time that I've been in the military here, most of the Ukrainian military guys are speaking Russian.
When I was in the front line, all I heard was Russian as well in Zaporozhye.
Yeah, like it's really funny, but a lot of times I feel like I'm the guy who's speaking the most Ukrainian at the front, and it's funny because I mean I do technically know Russian better, but I don't really use it anymore. I just understand.
Is that for political reasons?
It's funny. It's not so much political. It's just that I know a lot of other languages, and if I can plug like one language into my second language slot basically, and when speaking, like I have to use that one. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I've just met so many people who are now struggling through Ukrainian because they refuse to speak Russian now.
That is definitely a thing. But yeah, like I'll understand Russian fine. Sometimes I'll understand Russian better than Ukrainian. But if I try to speak Russian now, like I just keep defaulting back into Ukrainian, which for me is great. So I don't really have much other reason to speak Russian anymore. But yeah, so these language laws exist to reverse deliberate colonial policy. And this is, Ukraine is able to do that because it's a sovereign country, but Tatarstan can't do that. Bashkortostan can't do that. Circassians, all these people, they are basically, unfortunately, the rest of the world recognizes that as Russia's rightful territory, and they really shouldn't. And what is really disturbing to me, when you talk about pitying the people who are sent here, it is, in a certain level, it is heartbreaking when you see people from Buryatia, Dagestan, Tatarstan being sent here to fight for these Nazi slugs in Moscow, and they're losing a lot of their male population. Like one of the hardest hit areas in Russia is Tuva. Tuva is a tiny nation. It's one of the poorest regions in the entire country.
A banger old national anthem, though. They got some banger music.
Do they?
They do.
Yeah, Tuva is very famously associated with throat singing. Of course, a lot of Central Asia is as well. But their male population is being wiped out, and Buryatia, similar thing going on there. And what's really disturbing about it is, especially for groups like Buryats, Yakuts, Tuvans, people who are, let's say, not white-looking like Muscovites. Muscovites treat these people with absolute contempt. The racism in Russia is really open and in your face.
Did you see a lot of it while you were living in Russia?
Oh yeah, like one of the biggest things. One of the biggest things anyone can tell you about Russia when it comes to racism is if you are looking for an apartment, you're looking through the classified ads, or even like on the big websites for apartments. One thing you will typically see in many ads is Slavs only or Slavic appearance only. And so if you do not look Slavic, or let's say your name is not, let's say your name is like a Tatar name or something they don't know, then they're going to be suspicious about it. And luckily, being a Westerner usually meant that these landlords would relent. But I will tell you, several times before I had seen the particular landlord, when they knew I was from America and they were okay, but then they would ask if I was black, which is an interesting question.
Do you believe that if you said yes, they wouldn't run out to you?
I'm very confident, because anti-black racism in Russia is pretty widespread, not just among the like even among the so-called Russian liberal population. If you could see the stuff they were writing during the BLM protests in 2020, it was quite bad. It was like Fox News levels.
The Russian Foreign Ministry today, or it was yesterday, tweeted out an image of a African girl in a human zoo in Belgium from 1958, saying that this is the West. This is how the West behaved while we were engaged in anti-colonial struggle. Russia has a lot during this war kind of advertised themselves as an anti-colonial power. What would you say to something like that?
Well, I would say it's laughable because, first of all, Russia as it is, not just talking about its occupation in Ukraine, for example, but just Russia as it is a colonial power. When you look at that country and how big it is, it's insane to pretend that, that's just the natural realm of Muscovite Slavic Russians. It just happens to take up 1/6 of the world, right? It just makes absolutely no sense. When it comes to what they're doing in Africa, I find that really funny because apart from, again, the constant anti-black racism that you see in Russian society, what they're doing in Africa right now, especially Central African Republic, Mali, a little bit in Mozambique now, I believe, what they're doing is essentially like old school European colonialism, where it's all about resource extraction. They're sending mercenaries there. The mercenaries are generally they're propping up dictators.
The Wagner group is
Wagner, Wagner became famous for that. Wagner's pretty much committed atrocities in pretty much every African country it's been detected in. But Central African Republic in particular is the one where people started to really pay attention because they killed 3 Russian journalists who were investigating Wagner's presence there. And Wagner's presence was guarding certain mineral mines. I believe they may have been diamond mines. And that's basically what they're there for. And, of course, they nominally they're for security to protect from rebels. But, it's pretty clear that rebels could be whoever the dictatorial president says are rebels. So, they really are. I would say they're really starting to walk in the Belgian King Leopold's footsteps. Although to be fair, that's a tough act to follow. Hopefully, Russia as a state is dismantled before they can have that kind of impact on Africa.
I do want to ask, the idea of dismantling Russia as a state, as you said, a lot of Western policymakers would shiver at the idea of a state with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world being dismantled, a state that has existed for most of modern history, maybe not existed as it is now.
Yeah.
Does that make you take pause at all when you hear of the possible consequences of something, of the balkanization?
Well, that's the thing is a lot of people come up with these nightmare scenarios and they say the breakup of Russia will be like Yugoslavia times 1,000,000, right? Or they bring up the nukes thing. Now I have 2 responses to this. First of all, no one actually knows what a breakup of Russia will look like, but we do know what it looks like when you help keep it together, and that's exactly what the West did after 1991. The West, George Herbert Walker Bush was famous for the Chicken Kiev speech, as they called it, where he was kind of discouraging even Soviet republics to break off, right? But once it became clear that that's what was going to happen, the policy from the U.S. and Western states was like, okay, Soviet Union, break up, that's fine, but Russia needs to stay together because we need stability. We need to control the nuclear arsenal. So what happened? You had horrible problems with organized crime. You had tons of money, Western money poured into Russia, much of it that just disappeared. You had the West turning a blind eye to Russian military aggression in Georgia, in Moldova, threats of Russian military aggression in Ukraine, some of which go all the way back to 1991 before it was even independent. Russia had been threatening to take the Crimea and Donbass like in the early 90s. In fact, that was the risk of a war over Crimea was technically a thing up until about 1997 when they made an agreement on splitting the Black Sea Fleet and everything. But basically, and then of course we need to mention the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. That's when the West intervened to disarm Ukraine. And one thing is they didn't just disarm Ukraine of the nuclear weapons. They disarmed them of certain strategic bombers. Many of these were sent back to Russia. So it was, potentially conventional weaponry as well. And they also did the same with Belarus and Kazakhstan. So in return, these countries got what we now know are fairly empty promises of secure borders, the security guarantees. So there's a long list of this happening, and all this stuff happens for years before any new country joins NATO. And one of the things very frustrating to me is that the whole NATO expansion provoked this narrative. What frustrates me is that people can believe that. It sounds very intuitive because nobody knows what happened before that. Our media didn't really cover a lot of this stuff and nobody remembers much of it. So we have been fed this idea that we somehow wronged Russia in 1991, that we didn't help them enough, that we were mean to them and we shut them out of international relations while we expanded NATO. But most Americans don't know about Transnistria. They don't know about the wars on Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So in that sense, the whole NATO narrative, seems to make sense to them. But yeah, we kind of digress there a bit. But the other question is about the question of nuclear weapons. And what I say is that when someone says, can we trust that nuclear arsenal to be in the hands of, Bashkortostan or Tatarstan or something like that? What I hear is people saying, we can't trust those savage Muslims to responsibly care for nuclear weapons and, maybe voluntarily give them up. And I find it funny because it's like, well, look what happens when you let the white Slavic Muscovites have their nuclear weapons. Are they responsible with them? No, they are constantly making nuclear threats on a daily basis. Not guys on TV right up to the president of the country are constantly threatening to launch a first strike nuclear war on a daily basis, pretty much, right? So where is the evidence that the leader of an independent Bashkortostan is going to be more irresponsible with nukes than this little guy in a suit, Putin? I don't see the evidence for that. And so again, like these two arguments when they say the breakup of Russia will lead to instability. Well, I mean, Russia's going to collapse anyway. It's going to be unstable, right? And we don't know the exact results of that, but we do know the results of keeping it together. And one of those results is this war in which thousands of people have died, millions have been displaced, and numerous atrocities have been committed. So the question is, my question for anyone from State Department or decision makers or whatever is, why are you recommending we do the same thing that we've been doing for decades that has failed and had the opposite result? We have tried for years, for decades, to be friendly to the Russians, to reassure them that we're not their enemy, we're not after them. We've invested tons of money in that country. I saw Russia during the boom in the 2000s when all this European and American stuff was, dumped in there, and all these American franchises or European franchises were opening shops there and everything. And we gave them all that, and we opened up Europe to them. We opened up the U.S. to them. And what has been the result? They're still sure that we're secretly trying to destroy them, and because they're so mad at us, but they don't have the balls to pick a fight with NATO.
Do you believe that we're secretly trying to destroy them, or do you think that's just completely?
I wish. Honestly, here's the thing: is like a dominant belief in the ruling circles in Russia, and a lot of people like to attribute this to Alexander Dugin, but I think. For me, it's a question of like how much is it Dugin and how much is Dugin just sort of expressing a sort of mainstream view in Russian society. It's the view they are very how can I say, they're very into geopolitics. They believe in a sort of geopolitical determinism and national determinism. And as a result, they are sure that the world still works in this 19th century, great power rivalry, right? That's what, when they talk about wanting a multipolar world, what they're talking about is let's go back to the world before World War I, or let's go back to the world that gave us World War II, right? Because that's what happens when you have these rivals, imperial rivals, divvying up the rest of the world for them, right? Apart from the moral issue, which is that millions of people in smaller countries don't have any sovereignty or rights, there's the issue of the fact that this inevitably leads to massive conflicts. And so the idea behind the dominant idea in this Russian geopolitical theory is that Russia is a land power, and land powers must inevitably get into rivalries and conflict with sea powers. And they see the sea powers as the UK and, of course, the US. This is why you keep hearing the Russians say stuff about Anglo-Saxons, right? Because it used to be that the big sea power was Britain, right? And then the U.S. in naval terms kind of surpassed them during the Second World War, and that's kind of what gives the U.S. its global reach, right? And so they have this idea that they're land power, and they're always going to be in conflict. They're always going to be in conflict with the sea powers, the Anglo-Saxons or whatever. And they believe that this is just a natural state of things, that there are great powers and great powers will always be rivals, and it's stupid to negotiate and compromise. And if you can get away with breaking your word or an agreement, then that is good. And Western countries haven't figured this out yet. They actually think that, negotiations are about interest, and we can compromise if we can satisfy some of their interests and get our interests satisfied. But no, the Russians don't see it that way. The Russians don't believe in any compromise. If you look at any of their talk about negotiations or what they're offering in any of these situations, they don't concede anything. And they won't. If they did, that would be seen as weakness by the population in Russia. So my argument is this, is that we've tried reassuring them. We've tried to be peaceful. We dumped so much money into Russia. We fed that country when they couldn't feed themselves. Like in the 90s, the U.S. was sending tons of chicken legs to the Soviet Union, the late Soviet Union, and they actually have a term for it. They're called Bush legs in Russia, because it was the Bush Senior who was sending the chicken. And we did all this, and the entire time, all they tell themselves that we betrayed them, that we're trying to destroy them, and we have to have this rivalry, we have to stand up to the West. So it's like, okay, let's just give them what they want, right? You want to have another Cold War, you want to have this competition, fine, we'll do it, and we'll beat you like last time, and we won't have any pity to help you get back on your feet. It seems harsh and everything, but when you understand, when you've lived in that society, when you see what they've done now, and then you look like 100 years ago and you see they were doing the same thing, in countries that they may have invaded or annexed, you realize that this it's not going to reform. You know what I mean? Like, what you need in that country is a complete collapse of the state, you need self-determination for the captive nations, and you need a denazification program there. Because
you're saying we need a denazification program in Russia?
In Russia, yes. We need something akin to what we did to Germany.
I do want to bring this up shortly before moving to your work. The Russians have said that they need to invade Ukraine in order to denazify the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to ask you, is Nazism a major problem in Ukraine, and why do you think it is Russia that actually needs to be denazified?
Well, it's very simple. Ukraine is a free country. It is a democracy. And unfortunately, in free countries, people are free to believe stupid shit, right? I would say arguably the neo-Nazi or far-right movement is far more active in the United States and influential in the United States than it is in Ukraine. And it's not just the United States. Germany and some of our other Western European countries have far more powerful far-right parties, and the far-right has a bigger influence on society.
What would you say about the people who say, well, the difference is that there are fascists in the military in Ukraine, where in America, if that's found, you'll be kicked out?
It would be nice if all the fascists in the American military were kicked out. And it's even worse, as I hear, it's worse in the law enforcement community in the U.S. But the fact is that a lot of people slip through the system. It's usually it only happens if they like, let's say some of these guys that participated in the 6th January thing. I think there were at least a couple active duty military people or possibly reservists who were arrested. Yeah, and so if you did something like that, they would definitely get you. Whereas I think a lot of them still fly under the radar. But I think when here's the thing you got to understand about the definition of Nazi as the Russians use it and as the definition of like normal people living in reality use it. Nazi in Russia means simply you are opposed to Russia's regime, you're opposed to their foreign policy goals or whatever. It has nothing to do with espousing the ideology or ideas of the Nazi Party or similar far-right ideas. So, for example, as I point out many times, you could be for example, a socialist, a left-wing socialist, even a Marxist, a feminist, pro-LGBT, in an interracial marriage, let's say. You can be Jewish, all these things at the same time. And the Russians, but if you support Ukraine, its independence, and if you oppose what Russia's doing, you're a Nazi. By contrast, you can be a literal neo-Nazi, and if you work for, let's say, Russia Today, or just work for the Russians in general in some way, if you promote their ideology,
like in Rusich or something,
right? You can be an anti-fascist freedom fighter, right? And it's just like in World War II when he crushed the fascist Germany, right? But like, it's hilarious because there are so many people. There's a guy, thankfully he's dead now, but he was a correspondent for RT, Manuel Oceanreiter. He's from Germany.
You say thankfully he's dead now?
Well, when you hear about him, you will. He was literally an agent for the Russian intelligence. He worked for RT initially as a correspondent, editor or correspondent, I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure he was on camera. I don't know if he was already working for Russian intelligence while he was working for Russia Today, but at some point he was. He was attempting to stir up some kind of enmity. I should probably just stop saying that word.
Animosity?
Animosity is a good synonym, yeah. So he was trying to stir up animosity between the ethnic Hungarian population and Ukrainians in Transcarpathia. But this is the fun part. He was the editor of a German neo-Nazi magazine, right? And this was a guy who in 2014 was reporting from Crimea, reporting from Donbass, and talking about Ukrainian Nazis and Azov Nazis and things like that. And in fact, a lot of the so-called election observers that Russia brought in for their referendums and stuff like that. If you look at the list...
I don't know if you saw it on screen, but he put a referendum in air quotes. Just
yeah, I can't put enough air quotes there. But yeah, if you look at the list of people they invited to be election observers, it's funny because it's like, they're mostly all European, and it's like far right party, literal neo-Nazi, and then like somewhere in there you're gonna have like Communist Party of Italy or Communist Party of Greece, and it's like Don't you guys get a little suspicious when you show up and these are your fellow election observers and they're all Nazis?
In like the waiting room as they're all getting coffee.
Exactly, because I'm thinking, they used to have guys from the Greek Golden Dawn, and they had guys from KKE, which is the Greek Communist Party, right? I'm like, in Greece, these guys wouldn't be hanging out together doing the same thing. Like, how does that not get awkward? But that is the reality of Russian propaganda, disinformation. That's why I say most of the time online on Twitter, when I see people talking about Ukrainian Nazis or people, calling me Azov Nazi Bandera face or whatever, you look at their timeline and
have you ever met anybody in Azov?
No, it's kind of funny. I have seen people who are in Azov just like out and about. I have never actually met. I have talked to one guy in 2015. I met a guy in civilian clothes who claimed he had been in Azov, claimed he had been a prisoner in 2014. I can't speak to how accurate that was. All I can say is that he certainly did not express anything resembling racist or white nationalist beliefs. Just from a look at him, it seemed very unlikely that was his motivation. But, so I can't speak with that much authority, just more authority than, the average Western Twitter user, because the fact is that the Western media kind of bungled the reporting about these groups and sort of, I think they confused a lot of, the language they use kind of confused people as to like, what does it mean when they integrated the Azov battalion into the National Guard, for example. A lot of people don't know that when they did that, a lot of the original guys left. And because they didn't want to be a part of that, they didn't want to be under authority. So, there's a lot of these things that just kind of get left out. And but there are some good sources on it. Really try to dig into it. If I remember correctly, there's a very good article from, I want to say it's the Jerusalem Post, where they really just kind of dug into it. If I have it bookmarked somewhere, I might be able to. You might be able to include this in the link to this in the info. Yes. But yeah, I really can't speak with much authority on Azov. I've never really had anything to do with them. But what I do know is that what you have to look at when it comes to like actual Nazism, not Russia's definition, is that Russia is, and I say this with a lot of historical background and background knowledge on the topic. Russia is the modern equivalent to the Third Reich. Okay, politically, it is a fascist state. If you take any checklist of a fascist state from any let's say internationally recognized scholar of fascism, if you were to go through the checklist, Russia has all of these things. Just tick every box, basically. You have a cult of the one leader. You have the cult of so-called traditional values, which if you live in Russia, this is a complete joke. The biggest traditional value in Russia is stealing. Again, like our enemies are weaker than us.
Can I ask you what you mean by that? The biggest cultural tradition is stealing?
Oh, sure. Because it's the corruption. Like when people talk about corruption in Ukraine, but it's like in Ukraine, people try to actually fight it. Whereas in Russia, high-level corruption takes up a significant portion of their GDP. Just basically, kickbacks to friends of Putin, and then all the way down the line, you have a whole hierarchy of people who are skimming money out of every project. And the military is the perfect proof that this is what was going on. But you had cases like you had like 7-kilometer road near Sochi that was built for the Winter Olympics in 2014, and the cost of that road was more than it cost to get a rover to Mars, right around the same time, right? And this is a very commonplace thing in Russia, and they all know it. And if you ask Russians about it, they'll just say, "Oh, this is what happens." Russia will always has to be ruled by a strong hand because we are naturally corrupt, and of course the strong hand will also steal from us as well. But and it's a really fatalistic worldview, and it's actually it's quite funny because as much as the Russians talk about Russophobia, there is no view of Russians, I think, that is lower than the view that they promote in Russia, that they are hopelessly backward, they're hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly lazy. Like that's what their state kind of promotes to them. It's very subtle, but it works, and I would say it's even more pervasive than like the overt propaganda. But yeah, that's so that's the main value there, you could say, and again, like I said, just go down the fascism checklist. Like one of them was the enemy is simultaneously weak and also too strong, and that's what they say about NATO. The West is degenerate, it's weak, it's falling apart. Ukraine is falling apart. Ukraine is finished, but also Ukraine's full of Nazis that are going to invade Russia if we don't stop them.
Biological weapons.
Right, biolabs and all this nonsense. And so, yeah, like opposing Russia is anti-fascism. The idea that because some people somewhere in Ukraine may hold despicable views does not in any way justify what Russia is doing, nor does it make Ukraine's cause any less just. Because let's be honest, let's go back to World War II, right? We know damn well that a lot of the U.S. troops who fought against Nazi Germany and fought against Imperial Japan were open racist, right? I mean, the country was segregated, right? I mean, let's not sugarcoat it, right? But like, would you rather have the Third Reich still exist? Would you rather have Imperial Japan still occupying Korea and China? That's history. History is ugly sometimes. And I would say that in the case of Ukraine, Ukraine is a lot more innocent than many of the countries involved in that conflict. And yet, just because somebody can find a picture of some dipshit waving a black sun flag somewhere, that people act like, oh, well, now we need to ignore the fact that Russia is wiping Ukrainian cities off the map and they're stealing children and stuff like that. And I just find that absolutely ridiculous.
So we have a few more things,
yeah,
and then we're done. Just these are speed questions. Just get through them rapid fire.
Okay.
When you look at the policies of Obama, Trump, and Biden in reference to Ukraine, Obama being the first president since the Russians invaded Ukraine, going through the Trump presidency and the Biden presidency, how would you compare the responses, and which response do you prefer?
Okay, I'd say Obama's response was terrible. I think his foreign policy was absolutely awful. I think he's kind of a naive sucker when it comes to foreign policy, because he was getting duped by Putin back in 2013 over the East Ghouta chemical attack. Or actually, you could go back even further, because the first thing the Obama admin tried to do after Russia invaded Georgia was they tried to do a reset. And they tried to do this good faith thing. So I think he had this idea that him and Ben Rhodes, they had this idea that if you just try and negotiate with Russia in good faith, and they'll meet us halfway. And I feel that the U.S. and Germany really screwed over Ukraine in 2010 when they basically closed the door to NATO to them. That's why it's ironic when they say this was about NATO. The U.S. and Germany had the chance to get, or at least try to get, Ukraine in NATO as far back as like 2008, and they just didn't do it.
It was the Germans who objected to it, right?
The Germans especially, the French a bit, but also the U.S. The Obama admin was on board with it. And then, of course, when the Crimean Peninsula was again taken over, the Germans and the Obama admin were advising Ukraine not to resist. Now, there's a question of how much they could have resisted. From the sources I have, if they had put up any stiff resistance, they had like one brigade in the area that could have done that. Things might have gone a different way, but we can't say for sure. And then, of course, the other thing was the Obama admin was like strictly about non-lethal aid initially, pretty much to the end of his administration. And from the beginning, the Obama admin said there's no military solution, but clearly Putin disagreed. And, so they, you had the situation where the Western powers basically abandoned Ukraine. They kind of forced Ukraine into this idiotic Minsk II agreement. And
Not a fan of it?
no, not at all. It was a complete joke, and ever since that, I think a lot of the Western countries are just acting like, okay, here's another frozen conflict. You're bad, Putin, but we're just gonna, we're not gonna, how you say, we're not gonna try to revise the status quo. Because what Putin is good at is he understands that if he comes in there and makes facts on the ground, then he can portray any attempt to reverse that as warmongering and escalation, right? And the West was falling for that at the time. Now you move into Trump, and the thing about Trump is clearly not pro-Ukrainian. Worked with Paul Manafort, who has blood on his hands for his involvement in the Yanukovych regime. Pardoned Paul Manafort after he was convicted. Trump, of course, tried to get the Republican Party to remove lethal aid from Ukraine from their platform. They put it back in because it was too controversial. He tried to prevent military aid from getting to Ukraine, but supposedly Mattis was the one who pushed forward with that. Then, of course, he famously got impeached because he tried to withhold military aid in exchange for getting the Ukrainians to investigate this ridiculous Biden thing. Now, when some people try to say, "Oh, we didn't have this happen under Trump," well, here's the thing: we did have Russia doing shit under Trump. We had Russia try to attack the U.S. military in Syria, and we crushed them when they tried to do that. But we also had the Kerch Strait incident.
What are you referring to exactly?
The Battle of Hasham.
Was that under Trump? I thought that was under Obama.
That was under Trump. No, that was 2018. Yeah. But then we had in late 2018, I believe it was November, we had the Kerch Strait incident where the Ukrainians, even after the annexation of Crimea and everything, the Ukrainians were supposed to have the right to transit the Kerch Strait, even under that bridge that the Russians illegally built there. And they were trying to transit the strait, and they were basically attacked by Russian Coast Guard vessels, and the vessels were seized, and sailors were captured for, I think they were in captivity for like a year or something like that, or several months at least. And this happened under Trump, and there was really no response for it. In the case of why they didn't get more aggressive than that under Trump is that they like Trump. If you look at the Russian media, they like him, they support him. They don't see them supporting Biden. And this is the thing. I don't know how much of your audience consists of Trump fans, but I will speak directly to them and say this: Russia does not want what is good for America. They want the worst for America. So if they are supporting Trump and they think Trump is the best guy for America, well, they hate you. So that means they think Trump is actually going to wreck the country. Okay, that's what they literally believe.
When you say that the Russians want what's worst for Americans, what do you mean by that? What do you base that on?
It goes back to their bitterness and revanchism for losing the Cold War. Like I said, they believe that they're destined to always be a rival enemy, that the U.S. will always be their enemy. And of course, you want to defeat your enemy, right? And there's another angle to it. You see, in Russia, a lot of people don't know this about the propaganda, but a lot of Russian propaganda is not so much about how great it is to live in Russia, because you can only sell that so far. So what they have to do is try to make it seem like it's worse in other places. And what they like to do is sort of portray the West as okay, maybe they have more money, or okay, they have cleaner streets, they all have indoor toilets, okay, but there is chaos there. Here, there is stability. Here, there is family values and tradition, which is absolute bullshit if you ever lived in Russia. But the idea is here there's stability and things make sense because we have a wise leader. But in the U.S., it's chaos. Look at these protests. It doesn't matter what the protests are. It's they look at these protests, look at these people in the streets, what's going on? There's gender, all this stuff like that. And so this is the people who say that the Russians had Trump as an asset and they were using him the whole time. I don't really think it was so much of that. What I think is that the Russians just see Trump as a very polarizing figure, and he's not. And he's also, he's not competent, and he's in power, and it's good to have someone who's not competent in power in your your enemy country. You know what I mean? But that's the thing is like I said, like I don't care. If there's any MAGA people watching this, Russia hates you. Understand that they hate you, and anything that they support for America is something that they deep down believe is going to hurt you. Okay, like there's no. I mean, anyone who doubts me, like please go and master Russian and start watching Russian state media, and you will see that this is what they talk about on a regular basis.
There's also those people who translate it for you. There's been a lot more attention towards Russian state media recently.
Oh yeah, like Julia Davis. I don't know how she has not gone completely insane having to watch, because in my job I had to watch a lot of that stuff because my job revolved around countering disinformation, and it just drives me insane. Like I don't know how she hasn't just like I don't know, just like been running down the street, like shooting wildly and screaming when you see like enough of that nonsense on a daily basis. But yeah, getting back to the president. So now it's time for Biden. Biden is a real disappointment out of the gate. With all the talk the Dems had about Russia for like 4 years. I was hoping they wanted blood. I was hoping that I was hoping Biden would come in there and be like, enough of this malarkey, Jack. Like, we're getting rid of Russian corn pop here, and just arms for Ukraine.
So arms for Ukraine.
I'd like to see like arms for Ukraine, more sanctions, stuff like that. But the first thing they did out of the gate was Biden provided a sanctions waiver for Nord Stream 2 and for its CEO Matthias Varnig. And it was controversial, and he was trying to say, well, it's almost already built. And it's like, yeah, well, as we can see now, it can be stopped, right? Well, it could have been stopped back then. And then the other thing that disturbed me is that in April 2021, the Russians basically did like a trial run of this whole thing. They had some exercises and they left those forces around the border, and they started adding more. They were building up around the borders of Ukraine. And people are starting to talk about, what is this? Is this a real invasion? And at one point, there were some things that looked like actual provocations, actual attempts to, start something. And eventually by May, a lot of these units left and things kind of calmed down. But Biden's response to this was to call a summit with Putin in Switzerland. And that is a terrible idea, because that's exactly what Putin wants. He wants to look like he has parity with the U.S. Russia is a great power, and they can't decide anything without us. We always have to be at the table. And this summit accomplished basically nothing. And after that, like, there was no attempt to really beef up Ukraine's defense or start sending them arms. Like, what if they had started sending the Patriots back then? Okay, by the end of the year, you would have had trained Patriot crews and Patriot batteries in Ukraine. Right, and what if they had sent tanks at that time, right? Like, what was really stopping that from happening at that time? Like I said, I mean, even in December, even with the second buildup there, they didn't really start sending any kind of real, aid in large numbers until December, and then even, since then, it's just been trickling in. And so there were certainly opportunities to do more. And I really do think that it could have deterred Putin, not just because, maybe we wouldn't get enough weapons in the country, but just the fact that the U.S. would be like sending Patriot missiles and like some Abrams, that might tell Putin that...
Sends a message?
Yeah, it could tell Putin that the West isn't going to... We're not going to do the same thing we did in 2014, right? Because that's what he saw in 2014, is that, I will just grab this territory. I will say that, I'll say that they're not really Russians. I'll say we're not a party to the war, and then we'll just make it seem like anyone who wants to resist us is warmongering and escalating. And that's what I think he thought was going to happen here. I thought he believed that they would just grab the entire south coast of Ukraine and cut it off from the sea. They would grab Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast and maybe Kharkiv Oblast, and then probably not occupy Kyiv, but just, kill a bunch of people and put a puppet government in there. And he thought he'd get away with that. And the question is, why did he think he'd get away with that? Because of nearly 30 years of weak policy towards Russia and just constant coddling them and ignoring all their neighbors and ignoring the national minorities in favor of these corrupt Muscovites who are really responsible for all the suffering in Russia.
How important is American aid to Ukrainian victory?
I'd say it's crucial. I mean, most of the systems that have made such a difference here they do come from the states. The HIMARS system, obviously, the javelins. Maybe not the javelin I was using, but the other javelins certainly have done a good job. There have been TOW missiles that arrived, I think, several months ago. The Abrams, I think, are going to make a huge impact. The Bradleys will make a huge impact. There are Patriots now, and there's the Patriot training program and everything. NASAMS.
Can I ask you about the Patriots? Because I remember Emma Kasparian of the Young Turks recently did a piece where she said that the reason that Patriots are being sent over is for the weapons defense contractors, because these things don't work. Look at the Gulf War; they didn't really work.
Well, okay, Kasparian obviously isn't that well read up on it. I'm not an expert on the Patriot, but what I do know about the Patriot is that, the original Patriot, and they had some kinks in the first Gulf War, but that's 1991. Like, these systems have been improved considerably since then. I'm not sure. There's several different models of Patriots. I think the latest one is called the PAC-3. Again, don't quote me on that, but there have been improvements since then, and also a lot of these come from stocks that were like already existing, already paid for. So it's not like the defense contractor is getting paid more for them. They were already paid when they met it. In fact, this is the thing that just drives me insane about talking about military aid to Ukraine in general, is that everyone says like my tax dollars, and it's like, you got to understand, you already paid for this stuff. It's part of the U.S. defense budget. You may have paid for this stuff 10 years ago. And here's the thing, you would have to pay for that stuff again. You'd have to pay more if this stuff expires and has to be decommissioned, because a lot of this stuff has to be safely disposed of, right? So instead of disposing of and paying all the money you need to do that, we're transporting it to democracy to defend itself against a genocidal invasion. I say it's a pretty good deal, and if you actually break down how much money the average American is paying, and again, one thing I love is when people on Twitter say it's our tax dollars. I say, look, I'm an American citizen, born and raised. It's my tax dollars too, the problem is the media. Every time the media reports on aid for Ukraine, what do they do every time? $11 billion for Ukraine, $12 billion, $40 billion. And the problem is that everyone just looks at that headline, a dollar amount, and they think that we're loading up planes with sacks of money with dollar signs on them, and it's going to Zelensky, right? And it's like, no, you paid the money, the dollar figure there. Nearly all of that is the cost of military aid that was paid for, in some cases, decades ago, and that's being sent over there. And for that reason, you're not going to have to pay to decommission the stuff that we never got to use. Now, there's a lot of complaints people raise about that. I say, anytime, if it's a conservative person saying, oh, we should use that money for our homeless vets, I say, well, you guys told us that's socialism and that's evil, so no. And as for the more left-wing people, I would say, hey, we can actually finance this and finance stuff like healthcare and social programs. It's a question of political will, and that's a completely different matter. So next lightning question, if you have.
Yep, two left. What do you think of Zelensky as a wartime leader?
I think Zelensky as a wartime leader is where he's really sort of come into his own. When he first announced his candidacy in 2018, I thought it was just a joke. I thought he was just trying to promote his show, Servant of the People.
Because he was an actor.
Right.
He played the president of Ukraine.
Not just that, but he named his party after the show. So it really felt like this was like a promotional thing, right? And I remember, this is a very good lesson in how you really need to be in Ukraine to understand anything about what's happening in Ukraine, because I, at that time, actually started hanging out with some diaspora people. I do have some Ukrainian roots, but I've never really been connected to the diaspora at all. And I had been hanging out with some of these people, and they were all sure that the election was going to come down to Yulia Tymoshenko versus the incumbent Petro Poroshenko. And then in late 2018, I came to Ukraine, and I sound so much like fucking Thomas Friedman saying this, but like I was riding in a lot of taxis, and a lot of guys were asking me what I thought about the election. And people started bringing up Zelensky and how, they thought about voting for Zelensky. And so I said, why? And they told me that, well, he's an outsider, but they said, like, he can't do any worse because
You know what that sounds like, right?
I do know what it sounds
exactly
like.
what
Yeah,
that sounds like.
but there is one difference in the sense that in Ukraine, the problem is that even after Maidan, you had forces forces of the old corrupt guard who were trying to claw their power back, either claw it back or stop themselves from losing it. And Zelensky was someone who apart from his connection with Ihor Kolomoisky, he was seen as somebody who was disconnected from that. And initially, when he won, he was doing a lot of reforms and getting a lot of stuff done. But right before the invasion, like he was at his lowest in terms of
low polling numbers,
horrible polling numbers. He was hated. Well, this is pretty funny. Like when people talk about like, oh, the Russians had to invade because they were bombing Donbass. I love when people. There's kind of a joke in Ukrainians use. It's Dombili Bombas because a lot of people that don't know the name Donbass, and they Bombili would mean they bombed in Russian, and so there's these jokes about bombing Donbass 8 years, and the thing is that in reality. When Zelensky was president, by that time he was getting a lot of flack because they were ordering military units not to respond to Russian fire, especially Russian artillery fire.
He was elected on a pro-peace platform, if I remember correctly.
Partially, yeah. I'm not sure if that's what people really wanted from him. I think the idea was that they just wanted someone different. It was almost like, I think for many people, it was a protest vote. Poroshenko, his best accomplishments were mostly in like the cultural sphere, and I'm not going to say that's insignificant, but you have to remember that at the time, a lot of people in this country were making like $250, $300 a month, right? So like, it's great that Ukraine has its own independent church now, but some people they need a little more than that, you know what I mean? And so he was good at that, but he was really bad at the reform side of things, and
definitely the anti-corruption stuff.
Yeah. And Zelensky was a bit better at this, but he started to backslide around, I want to say 2020. And that's where he got in this sort of, this trough where he was just horribly unpopular. And I remember like 3 days before the invasion, there was a big article in the Atlantic or something that said like, Ukraine's comedian president is not up to the challenge or something, or, can't. Or in over his head, right? And when the war came, it's like that saying, "Cometh the hour, cometh the man." That's when like he stepped up, and that's where I think he was good because he's a showman. He understands narratives, and he understands the importance of narratives in a war. And Western leaders tend not to understand this too well, and that's why there's a lot of problems. Fighting back against like Russian disinformation, because Russian disinformation has narratives. It tells a story, right? And one thing is it tells the viewer, it tells you that if you believe us and you disbelieve our opponents, then you're a critical thinker. You're smarter than everyone else. You know what's really going on.
You're in the Tom Clancy novel. You know the real truth.
Yeah, exactly. You've taken the red pill. You've escaped the Matrix. And honestly, like, I mean, if you're older than 16 and you see the world as like the Matrix, or you use the Matrix reference for anything, like please seek help. Like,
is Andrew Tate not big over here in Ukraine?
Thankfully no, but apparently the Matrix has him in Romania right now. It's like Agent Smith is.
You ever think of doing a raid to break him out, free him?
Free him? No, I think. Yeah, he'd be swimming in the Danube after that. He's probably,
I'll edit that out.
Yeah, I said that out.
Last question. Last question before you can say.
Because he's gonna make a fucking video. It's gonna be like, Ukraine is threatened to assassinate me.
Ukraine is threatened to assassinate. Yeah. If you could say anything to Putin, what would you say?
That's a good question.
I know. I love asking people that question.
I don't know. Maybe it'd just be something like face the wall.
Face the wall. Damn. You'd want to be the person to execute the sentence.
I don't know, because now I'm thinking like a gunshot seems too too humane for such a horrible guy. The guy who employs so many brutal torturers. It seems like it seems like he deserves something like just getting like stomped to death, or something that's kind of like slow and terrifying. Not
you want him to have like the Gaddafi treatment, is what you're saying.
We've used that as a verb. I just want to say, I don't endorse the specifics of that treatment, but if you look at it in like the same way as like Mussolini and what happened to him, that was pretty brutal too. So let's just call it. Let's say he should be Mussolini'd.
Mussolini.
And I'll tell you this. I don't really put much stock in his judo black belt. I mean, with all due respect to the world of judo, I think, I'm just talking about Putin here, I think he's out of practice. And
you don't think Steven Seagal gave him any, pointers?
Hopefully he did. That'd be really funny, because Steven Seagal and these guys, it's supposedly he's training the Russian army in hand-to-hand combat, and
I saw that.
Well, Steven Seagal's methods are extremely deadly if you like give him your wrist and then go along with him when he tries to throw you, but if you don't do that, you should be fine. I think because you train in boxing, I think if you just kind of dance around him a bit, he'll have a heart attack. And
that's true. I remember somebody saying, "Dylan, do you really think you beat up Putin?" He's like, he's like a judo and black belt. I was like, he could beat Muhammad Ali. When Muhammad Ali was like 1 foot out of the grave, he was still an old man. There's not really much he can do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a good question. Like, can we fight Putin? I mean,
can you beat Putin in a fist fight?
Yeah, like my background is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a little bit of judo, and like MMA kickboxing, and I'm pretty confident I could kick the shit out of him.
If you had the opportunity to do one move to him, right, whether it be a chokehold, a punch, something, what would you do?
Well, see, there's a huge height difference between us, okay, and one thing about Putin is that he's very short. Some people don't realize like how small that guy is.
He's a small guy.
Tiny little like sort of like Smeagol-like guy. And I would just like to throw a front kick just right into his chest when he's up against a wall. That would just be so fun. Just like launch that little guy into a wall, and after that, I don't know, kick him when he's down. I don't know. It's Putin. He's not human. He's Putin. Okay, no reason to get upset.
Last thing is, I always give somebody an opportunity to say any message you want to send out to the people who would watch this, the largely English-speaking community. Anything you want to put out for the historical record, because that's the main reason I'm doing this, is to make sure that in the future people can watch this 100 years from now. Anything you want to say?
Well, I think the big thing I want to say is that, you don't get many chances in history to see what is such a black and white conflict. A lot of history is ugly. And even some of the most morally righteous conflicts have their dark chapters in them, even on the side of good. This is really, if you actually know the history and you actually study the countries involved here and everything, this is very black and white. Okay. Is everybody in Ukraine an angel? No. Are some people in Ukraine complete assholes? Yes. But there is simply no justification for what Russia is doing here. And Russia has been very open about their aim is to basically eliminate Ukraine as a state, which means eliminating people. And they are doing this because they believe they have this right to empire. And you have to understand when people talk about, just negotiate, make concessions. Well, sorry, you talk about conceding land, you're talking about conceding people. What will you say to the people that will have to live under this Russian dictatorship when there's no one coming to liberate them? What will you say to the millions of people who left because the Russians occupy their territory and now they can't move back? What are you going to say to those people? And Russia shows no sign that it will negotiate in good faith. We have no reason to think they would hold to any agreement because they have broken literally every other agreement they have made with Ukraine. So really, there is one solution here: that the Russians only understand force. They only understand violence. They will lie to your face. I mean, they will tell you that the sky is, green, yellow polka dot, even as you look at it. They will do this, and they will actually tell you they will do this, right? And the only thing you can do with that, you can't reason with that. You can't use logic or debate. It's violence. That's the only thing that works in this case. And because they have decided to embark upon a war of imperial conquest, because they use violence themselves, it's a simple matter of, live by the sword, die by it, right? And the thing is that I'd also like people to understand that, this is about a lot more than Ukraine. This is about this is about decolonization. This is about self-determination of smaller nations. This is about anti-imperialism and anti-fascism. It's about anti-kleptocracy. One of the scary things I saw in the States is that from 2017 to 2021, a lot of the liberals were going crazy about what they saw the Trump admin doing. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, oh, I've seen this kind of thing before. That's what they do in Russia, like all the time. We, in America, I think we are very close to entering a sort of kleptocracy where, you're no longer seeing the same type of malfeasance that you used to see with large corporations and everything. You're seeing something where you're going to see people using their state connections and just using the direct connection to the state to basically get money, mostly from, tax money. People using state power to, as they call it, rent-seeking behavior, right? This is what you have in Russia. This is what you have in places like Hungary. And this is the thing that Russia is exporting to the world. In the Soviet Union, they were exporting Marxism, as they claimed it. And that limited them in many ways. It limited them because Marxism tended to be the realm of the intelligentsia. It is also the realm of like trade unions and workers and students, not really powerful people. But Putin's Russia is selling a different idea. They're selling kleptocracy and authoritarianism. They're saying, hey, look, rich people, why do you tolerate things like rule of law and regulations and democracy? Why don't you just have a system like ours where, your elections are fake and, you give your friend, you use your state power to give your friends contracts, kickbacks and stuff like that. And that's very dangerous because that is an ideology that appeals to the elite of other nations, the people that actually have power. And so if we don't fight back against that tendency, both at home and both, here in Ukraine, that kind of kleptocracy will spread, And I realize there's a lot of people in the West and the States are very dissatisfied with the situation in their country, and they think, oh, it's just as bad. But see, once you do that, then they've already won, because you have rights in the States to fight back against a lot of this corruption. You have the right to try to change the government. They don't have that in Russia, and if they take over parts of Ukraine, wherever they occupy, you don't have that right. You can be arrested for pretending to hold a protest sign by yourself in public. So that's, I had a lot of people, from the U.S. ask, like, well, what's the difference? Like, here's an example of the U.S. government doing this. I said, hey, the difference, it may seem subtle to you, but when you've actually lived it and you've actually seen, how it looks in real life, you realize that small difference is really significant.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview.
No problem.
Really appreciate it, man.
Thank you for watching this Ukraine Uncensored interview. I hope this first-hand testimony of the war in Ukraine helped you better understand those who are caught in the violent throes of history. We have a bunch of other videos interviewing those affected by the war on the ground in Ukraine that you can check out on my channel. If you want to help fund my work so I can do more interviews like this in the future, please support me at my Dylan Burns TV Patreon page. I have a second YouTube channel called Dylan Burns Live, where you can see my videos from my live stream, which you can view on my Twitch or on my website, dylanburns.tv, every weekday from 6 p.m. EST to midnight. And if you want my hot takes or photos from my time in Ukraine, check out my socials, including at DylanBurns1776 on Twitter and Dylan Burns TV on Instagram. All links, including a community Discord, are in the description below. See you guys next time.